APG, and I also wanted everyone to know that this will be recorded and will be on the AEA site. So Chris, welcome, and thank you for doing number 4 in our series. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Birgit, and welcome everybody. So today we're going to talk about Agile Enterprise Architecture as a part of our series with the AEA on building an architecture platform. And so, just a little bit about APG first. We're members of the open group, participate considerably with the Architecture Forum, the Archimate Forum, as well as the recently formed IT for IT Forum. And our mission is really, trying to help advance those industry standard best practices in the open group and other standards organizations such as the object management group. And then, of course, bring those practices down to earth to end user organizations, and of course, then feed that back to the evolution of standards. And we're also partners with a number of tool companies. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end, but ultimately with some of the major players such as IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Sparks, and others as it relates to operationalizing the enterprise architecture capability. So what we'll talk about is, what are some of the typical pitfalls and challenges that we've seen and perhaps you guys have with enterprise architecture. We're going to take a look at the Agile Manifesto for software development as a basis for some of the discussion and historical context, and then use that to, translate into a set of Agile enterprise architecture principles. And we'll talk about some of the ways that we can borrow on some of those concepts for planning and delivering Agile enterprise architecture. And then we'll provide a simple use case to demonstrate, again, how agility can be injected into architecture-grounded processes such as technology lifecycle management, and then a little bit about how we can support that stuff with an appropriate set of tooling. So, I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with the architecture development method, or ADM, in TOGAF. It's shown here, and typically described as the crop circle. And, makes statements within the standard about the ADM as iterative, over the whole process between the phases and within the phases. And every time you go through the ADM, you certainly want to be very thoughtful about scope. So, how much of the organization you're going to touch, which domains you're going to go play in, the level of detail you're going to go to, and how much time you've got. And something that will certainly inform that is the state of your architectural assets, how available and accessible they are and useful for, accelerating the architecture effort. But, this is, I think, where one of the challenges, begins with how do we perform enterprise architecture according to TOGAF. So TOGAF has this attribution about, the ADM is an iterative life cycle, but when we take a look at the crop circle, it sure doesn't look like an iterative approach. It really seems to be a very waterfallish, serial, linear set of activities where, you perform, the framework and principles activities first, and then once they're completed, you begin, with the reception of the request for architecture work out of phase H, to begin phase A, architecture vision, and once those activities are done, you do the business architecture, and once that's done, you go ahead and do the information systems architecture, so on and so forth. And, of course, that's inferred by the unidirectional arrows between these circles that represent the groups of activities. But, the TOGAF does, again, make it clear that, you're not supposed to over-interpret this too much, as being a specification for a linear kind of waterfall process. But I would just throw out there, just to be provocative, if TOGAF isn't supposed to be necessarily delivered in this linear set of activities, then why the heck is it described this way? So, I think it's really important to, look at this as really a conceptual process model, not a logical or physical process model that basically says, generally speaking, there is a general flow to these activities, but how you might actually execute them in reality might be a little bit different. And so, and that's, I think, a heart of the issue of what we're going to try to address today. But, this is also, I think, a consequence of TOGAF really being a descriptive framework, really talking about what you're supposed to do, but not a prescriptive framework, getting into how should you actually do it. So, as a life cycle, one of the things that I look at that seems to be obviously missing is the idea of milestones. Like, how do I know when I'm done with these activities? Are there criteria that help me understand whether I performed the activity sufficiently enough to advance to the next stage in the architecture development project? So some people might claim that's prescription. Some people, would say, well, because of that, it's not something we want to talk about in TOGAF. But as we engage organizations, those tend to be some of the real visceral, real-world questions that people ask us, most immediately. So, if we take a step back and think just a little bit about, what is enterprise architecture, as a whole, we claim that ultimately, and I think TOGAF backs this up, that, enterprise architecture is the way for implementing business agility. The whole idea that we've got the ability to have some enterprise organizational intelligence that allows us to understand what's going on in our environment, both internally and externally, and being able to respond effectively and efficiently to those changes that are going on and exploit, the opportunities that are in front of us. So, I think it's really important to take that step back, that the value proposition of enterprise architecture is to deliver agility, whatever that might mean. And so, we need to be careful about overusing that word. It certainly has got, some affinity for good things and bad things, depending on an organization's experience and perspective. So we do need to, in the real world, contextualize and quantify what does it mean to get more agile. Is it, are we talking about increasing the capability and capacity to deliver solutions more rapidly, more effectively? Is it about shortening the development life cycle? Is it about having more funds available for innovation as opposed to keeping the lights on and that operations and maintenance kind of activity? But ultimately, the way that we look at it, is when you're going through the ADM, you're basically saying our current level of performance is not acceptable and sufficient. We need to and can do a better job. So we need to come up with a plan that directs us and guides us on how are we going to move from our current state, which is presumably less effective and not as capable as we'd like, to some more agile future state that allows us to deliver our value to our customers in a timely fashion in the context of a certain set of other metrics. And so we need, a plan for, transforming the organization to do that. And that's really what I see enterprise architecture providing, is that the ability to exploit, enterprise intelligence to get a, clear line of sight across the enterprise in order to make the right kind of investment decisions, and then put together a plan for how we're going to realize those so that we can go from our current baseline level of performance and capability to some future target state. And then, as you guys probably know from TOGAF, the notion that we might have to establish some intermediate milestones along the way. TOGAF calls those transition architectures. And this is, based on, a couple of principles, namely, most organizations have a finite appetite for waiting long periods of time to see the results of an investment. There are certain things, because of complexity and whatnot, that do require a long amount of time, but we need to be able to show something of value incrementally as we, traverse and go through this roadmap. And then, I don't know if it's ever happened to you guys, but there's certainly the reality that even if you've been, came up with a perfect plan, whatever that means, you're delivering on it very effectively, but then you come to work one day and all of a sudden the world has changed and what was the most important thing in the universe no longer is. So we need to be able to, tack and change our approach based on new information. And so these transition milestones also provide that ability to say, well, we've made some achievement towards what we thought the target architecture was. Now there's some new priorities, but we've got something to show for it. So it's really important to have a kind of that stage delivery as we move towards, again, incrementally increasing the agility of the organization over time. So some of the challenges that we've seen organizations have with enterprise architecture is the perception of EA as being an academic exercise. And this is something that is very, unfortunately, very typical for an EA community that, is staffed with a bunch of really bright, intelligent, perhaps even capable people, but doesn't really have much connection to the concerns and problems that people are trying to solve on a regular basis. So this, degenerates into what a lot of people call the ivory tower syndrome. We put a whole bunch of real smart people together, and they come up with roadmaps and plans and models and all this kind of stuff, but the content never really resonates or is integrated with the rest of the enterprise, so never really makes a difference. And one of the things that we've found is explanation of why this occurs is there is not a lot of clarity between how the business and IT are supported by enterprise architecture activities. So we find often that in different parts of the organization, different parts of IT are trying to solve similar problems using different approaches, different tools, collecting different data. And there's really a lack of understanding of how this content could be more effectively exploited across the enterprise. There are missed handoffs between internal IT life cycles as well as those that support the business, and a lack of effective process integration. One of the other challenges that we've seen people face is the whole idea that you practice enterprise architecture as a monolithic process, as a centralized set of linear serial activities where we have to completely understand something before we can move on to completely understand another thing. And something that contributes to that, I think, is the notion that we often get caught up in history and get lost in the past. So one of the anti-patterns that we often see, ironically, when people start getting more aligned with tooling is, now that I've got a shovel, I can dig places and find stuff, and I can unearth all sorts of interesting things about the current state of the enterprise. And so we call that, unbounded archaeological excavations. And we really need to be very careful that just because we have tools and capabilities to describe the enterprise at many different levels of detail and abstraction, that we really need to make sure that we take that step back and understand, is that the best use of our time? What's the value we're getting out of that? And how is this contributing towards us realizing our target state? And also we find, the idea that, delivering value later versus sooner is a big challenge, and this is because a lot of the complexities of the enterprise. But somehow enterprise architecture has to figure out, how can I add value as soon as possible, because things are changing so fast in enterprises and in the market with technology that if EA can't respond in an effective time frame, they're just going to be left behind and not have an opportunity to really kind of do the influence that we'd like to see as it relates to realizing some of those effective outcomes. So just to kind of contextualize and kind of paint a picture, we have noticed that there's a paradox that we often face, particularly in solution delivery, around estimation and sizing. So, for example, has anyone ever asked you, and maybe it's only been a matter of 10 or 15 minutes today, could you please tell me how many people, how much money, and how much time it's going to take to build this thing that we really don't understand at all? And, from our experience, that's something that happens very, very, very frequently. And, really the answer is, well, that's kind of irrelevant. I mean, certainly, it's important for us to have a discussion about the kind of resources that need to be brought to bear and the complexity and the risk and all that. But it's really more of an issue of how much money do you want to spend and how long do you want it to take? And, if I were to say, we need a new, accounting capability, and or uplift that accounting capability. It needs to be done in 6 months, and we've got, $500,000 to do it. The one thing that we can absolutely for certain guarantee is that after 6 months, $500,000 will be missing from our checking account. However, what we don't necessarily know is, was that a worthy investment? Did it make sense to spend that money on that capability in that time frame? And so what we really want to be, thoughtful about is that any development effort, at least in my experience, will consume all of the resource that it is given. That is an absolute certainty. Not to, give credit to those remarkable teams and individuals that often are able to get done, ahead of schedule or under budget. But, one of the things that we often see can explain some of that as well is that we often have a culture of padding our estimates and our resources to anticipate, the reality that things are going to certainly evolve and change as we go through this development effort. So, sometimes our original estimates are a little bit too high, a little bit too squishy, and we just want to be, again, really thoughtful that we need to have a continual engagement with our customer throughout the development life cycle as we mutually come to understand what it means to, deliver success. Because, what I've seen, and perhaps many of you have as well, is that, no matter how good of a job you do in, eliciting requirements and documenting those requirements, either as a set of, use cases or features or user stories, that there's just absolutely, no substitution for showing the customer, the results, i.e., a prototypical, vision of the actual operational software itself. And, this may not be a story that you hear very frequently, but, I think it does represent, the reality that, we often go off and collect these requirements, build something, show it to the customer, and they say, you did exactly what I told you to do based on what we agreed upon, but now that I see it, I don't think that was the right thing to do. Now, unfortunately, we often don't get cast in that more positive light, but that really really needs to be the affirmative kind of engagement model, we need to have with our customers. And, this is ultimately why we feel that we need an agile approach towards delivery throughout the enterprise, not just in solution delivery, but also in enterprise architecture, because one of the things that we find is that there's often a disconnect between the pace at which agile teams in particular are moving and how effectively enterprise architecture can respond to those needs. And so we really want to think about, an agile iterative approach to development is ultimately a call to how can we optimize the most effective use of a constrained set of resources to get the biggest return on investment and influence on the outcomes of the business. So, real briefly, let's review the manifesto for agile software development. And, just to kind of boil it down into its essence, there's this idea of traditional principles that, come out of some of the monolithic software methods back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, where, that there is, value on the things that are on the right, those traditional principles. The ones on the left are more valuable. So instead of focusing too much on processes and tooling, we really want to make sure that we've got good interactions and have good individuals contributing and interacting within our development environments. As opposed to comprehensive documentation, we want to make sure we deliver, working software that meets requirements, that's usable and effective by the end user. We want to move away from rigid contract negotiation and more into more effective customer collaboration and being, involved in joint missions, and that having a plan is okay, but we need to make sure that we effectively respond to change. And so what we did is, took a look at those agile software principles, which seems to make a lot of sense, and try to see if we can uplift those to an enterprise architecture-driven approach. So, in a very similar spirit, we want to make sure that we sustain a continual stakeholder interaction So we need to have some kind of life cycle and approach that makes sure that we're regularly interacting with our enterprise architecture stakeholders, that we are, delivering useful content that's based on sufficient and relevant levels of information, but no more detailed than absolutely required, but giving us the ability to make, again, informed decisions, but being able to, again, respond to the notion that we're going to have to deal with continual change. I mean, that's just, kind of the whole idea. I often, throw out to people just an interesting question, when are you done with enterprise architecture? And of course, the answer is, well, when you're dead or out of business. Namely, because organizations have to continually respond to change, and enterprise architecture is ultimately a platform for helping the organization figure out what those changes are and how to respond to those, you're never going to be done with it. And a part of the effectiveness of enterprise architecture is, particularly as we try to look at an iterative, agile way of delivering architecture content, is how can we move from more monolithic, waterfall-like processes that the ADM portrays, but doesn't necessarily, again, suggest is the way to do it, of how can we continually engage the customer and demonstrate fit for purpose of our architecture content. And that's a key thing that I think is really important to keep your eyes on throughout the life cycle. Is it's not about aligning with a reference model. It's not about following a process. I mean, those things are all well and good, but we need to make sure that, whatever investments that we're making in building architecture content, that it's useful for helping us solve the problem that we're being asked to solve. So we really, want to think about the concept of minimal sufficiency, which is kind of a corollary to what does agile development really mean when we get down to performing activities on a regular basis. And so it's really about how can I do the least amount of work that's required, that's absolutely essential to achieve this mission, but do absolutely no more than is needed. And that's a balancing act that can be quite a struggle, and I'll talk a little bit about some simple techniques that you might be able to exploit to help deal with that. We want to, delay critical decisions and actions to the absolute last possible moment, but not any later than when it needs to happen. We want to, stop doing things when they're done enough, whatever done enough means. So, we want to use our methods and frameworks as guidance for that, but then get, feedback and intelligence from the stakeholders we're working with on when, we've reached that minimal sufficiency threshold. And this is based on, something that I've observed, and perhaps many of you have, is, if we think about, the traditional way of doing project planning that hopefully many of us don't have to deal with anymore, but I still see quite a bit of it yet, is, coming up with a detailed work breakdown structure, for example, at the beginning of a project, knowing full well that 90% of it's going to change as we go through the rest of the life cycle, or, spending a huge amount of time investing in writing a set of requirements, knowing full well that 75% of them are going to change in a non-trivial way as we, begin to really come to grips with what they mean. So there's this notion if we do too much work too soon, there's a high risk and a high likelihood that we're going to have to perform that work again. So that really begs the question then, well, why did we do that work in the first place? So that's, again, getting to, could we have done a subset of that, a minimally sufficient subset of that to inform people about what's going on, and then, deferred some of those decisions to a little bit later when they were much more contextual and relevant, so that we don't end up, again, intentionally creating rework in our projects, because rework's going to happen anyway. And, ultimately, as relates to all this, how well, the architecture content that we're building is, addressing the concerns of the enterprise is really going to be based on how well it responds to change. So we really should try to get to that perspective as soon as possible and bake it in to our architecture development lifecycle. So what we've done at APG is we've taken, the notion of the content that's described in TOGAF's ADM, and we've reconfigured it into what we consider a true agile lifecycle. And we call that ATPL+. This is based on our APG TOGAF process library, We've taken all the content in TOGAF, described it using an industry standard called SPEM, the Software and Systems Process Engineering Meta Model, and then used a tool called Eclipse Process Framework, EPF Composer, to capture that content. And one of the outcomes is the ability to, again, reconfigure the TOGAF ADM content for an Agile lifecycle. And, some of you may find this diagram familiar. We certainly borrowed it from Rational, now a part of IBM. This is, often called the humpback chart, because it reminds some people of a herd of migrating humpback whales. And the thing that I like about this visualization of process is it really separates the difference between what we do, which we call disciplines over here on the left, and those are, again, these enterprise architecture disciplines that are related to TOGAF, and when we do them, which are the different phases of the life cycle. And you don't want to take the spread and height of these curves on the right too literally, but it's really trying to demonstrate what I think a lot of us find in practice, which is, more often than not, when we're doing, development, we actually are doing a lot of the same things over and over and over again. There may be some emphasis on certain activities more early on in the life cycle as opposed to the end of the life cycle. But if we were to take, a slice out of the day in the life of an architect, we may find ourselves as a part of a team, performing many of these different activities, perhaps even simultaneously. And so, what we recommend is to, use the milestones that come out of the work that Barry Boehm did, because, Rational, of course, didn't invent this stuff. They borrowed heavily on the work of Dr. Barry Boehm at USC, where he wrote a paper called Anchoring the Software Process, where he talked about we really want to stop focusing about what we're doing in software development and software engineering and really take a step back and think about why we're doing that. And I'll explain a little bit more about that on the next slide. But the idea here is that we've got 4 different phases of the Agile lifecycle: initiation, stabilization, production, and transition. Those of you that might be familiar with the Rational model will note that these are slightly different names, and we don't necessarily need to get into the semantics of all that. But the idea is that, when we're trying to get done with the first phase, we're really trying to make sure we understand the problem that we're trying to solve. And this is where, certainly where in the ADM, the architecture vision phase plays a big role. But as many of you may know, something that's not real clear from the crop circle diagram is that when you're doing phase A, you're actually supposed to do a little bit of phase B, C, and D, namely in the context of creating a high-level and baseline target architecture. And so, we need to, do some requirements elicitation, make sure we understand the context and the strategic plans, work with stakeholders to figure out what they think the problem is and why enterprise architecture might, be a good way to solve that problem. And then do a little bit of business data application and technology architecture modeling as a basis for that, and possibly, this is something that I think is a really good idea, do some preliminary migration planning, maybe even right away, just to give people a sanity check on, well, just what are some of the time horizons that you think are pertinent as it relates to actually delivering on the target architecture. But in the second phase, we're really trying to focus on making sure we understand the solution, focusing on high-risk items. And this is where we expect things to possibly change a lot as we start diving into lower levels of detail in the most risky, contentious areas. And in the context of TOGAF, we would expect that by the end of this second phase, stabilization, that's where you would hopefully approve the final version of the architecture vision. Because one of the things, of course, we have to be careful about is if we don't have concurrence and agreement with our stakeholders about scope and outcomes, it's going to be very difficult for us to effectively deliver when every minute people are changing their minds about what we're trying to do and how we're trying to get there. So once, you basically know you're done with the second phase when there is that stakeholder concurrence that, we have high levels of assurance that significant requirements aren't going to change and that our architectural approach is sound because we've proven that. And then, that allows us to get into the third phase we call production. That is basically finishing up the rest of the enterprise architecture work as we move into the final phase, which we're basically trying to get the solution out into the enterprise for regular usage and consumption. So, kind of summarizing this stuff, we've got these 4 different phases, a set of milestones associated with it, again, starting with initiation, understanding the problem, create that initial version of the architecture vision as we try to meet the life cycle objectives milestone. And these milestones are what Barry Bain talked about in his white paper, Anchoring the Software Process, and IBM, or Rational at the time, very effectively saw the value in that and folded that into their view of iterative development in the unified process. Again, the second phase, we're really trying to understand the solution, agree upon that final version of the architecture vision. We need to assess the viability of our candidate target architectures. And that's something I'll talk a little bit about in a second, but and just to give you a chance to noodle on it, one of the key aspects of Agile solution delivery is test-driven development. And I think most people would agree, while it can be challenging to do that, it's very, very effective. But what does it mean to do test-driven development in enterprise architecture? So we'll talk about that in a slide or two. And again, begin some of that preliminary migration planning. But we ultimately, want to be thoughtful about, just because we hit this line in the sand of saying, hey, we believe we understand the solution, we believe that significant requirements aren't going to change, or I should say, we are going to take a different disposition towards requirements changing after we finish this part of the life cycle, because it's certainly naive to think that just because we hit, the life cycle architecture milestone at the end of stabilization, that suddenly magically requirements are going to stop changing. Of course, that's just completely absurd. Requirements never stop changing. But what we're basically trying to get concurrence with our stakeholders is that we have to reach a point in this life cycle, in this process, where you're going to agree not to significantly change the direction of this effort, because if you keep doing that, you'll never believe the estimates that we give you about when we're going to be done, because we never know, because you keep pulling the rug from underneath us. So let's talk about how can we complete this cycle of development, and then any changed requirements that come up in the third phase really need to be put under stringent change control and ultimately put into the backlog for saying, hey, we're never done with this enterprise architecture thing. So, we're going to get to that stuff, but we need to finish this body of work first. So that's where we, focus on completing the target architecture descriptions, refining the migration plans and transition architectures, and then ultimately in the fourth phase, make sure that the organization's prepared to operate in the context of the new plans and architectures and reference models. So we want to make sure that, governance, for example, is in place, solution delivery is in place, and that the architecture community is prepared to support the dissemination of those best practices through numerous communities, in particular, solution delivery. So again, when it comes to the whole idea of doing agile release planning and capability-based planning, as it's called in TOGAF, we really want to think about when we're doing enterprise architecture work and going through the crop circle. Thinking about using similar techniques that we've used in software development for labeling, the new releases of capabilities. So here's, just a very simple example of, 3 different releases of enterprise architecture content. Each one of these releases has 4 different phases, where again, once we hit the stabilization phase, we start putting things in the backlog for the next release, knowing full well that, again, we're not going to be done and we're going to have a continual stream of delivery. But this is where we can, at least try to visualize the notion of how do we test an enterprise architecture. Well, we need to be really thoughtful about who are the primary consumers that we're bringing, who we're building the enterprise architecture for. And at the end of the day, I think that, we need to be, of course, very thoughtful about, enterprise architecture as it relates to, business and IT executives and strategic planners and all that kind of funky stuff. But at the end of the day, if we don't have the capability to deliver the target architecture, none of this really makes any difference at all. So we really focus very specifically on the notion of integration with the solution delivery lifecycle. So if we think about, since the solution delivery community and then subsequently the IT operations is going to be the people that build this stuff and keep it running, we need to get the target enterprise architecture content in the hands of prototypical solution delivery projects as soon as possible. So instead of waiting until the end of the enterprise architecture project, phase F of the ADM, we need to think about providing, even if it's not completely ready for operational capabilities yet, even in the stabilization phase, because it's going to be really difficult for us to demonstrate that we've diminished risk if we have no evidence from that. So even though, again, those assets may not be completely suitable for usage by the solution delivery projects, we need to get some real-world feedback on their fit for purpose and suitability. And if that, involves actually trying out some things to get some feedback, then that's going to be an important thing to do. So we want to make sure that our enterprise architecture iterative plans are integrated with the solution delivery portfolio to identify, again, those projects that are going to be used to prove out and get feedback just like we do in the Agile solution delivery lifecycle. One of the things that we need to be thoughtful about, of course, and this is a challenge I see a lot of organizations wrestle with, is not having enough architects to go around. And so, in an ideal world, at least from an enterprise architecture perspective, we would like to engage, every solution delivery project to make sure that, they understand where they fit into the roadmap and they understand their organizational context, some of the enterprise requirements and governance that they're going to need to be subjected to. But, the reality is there's usually never enough architects to go around. So we often find people compensating for this by going through basically triage exercises and risk assessment exercises about, well, there's 1,000 projects going on in this enterprise. We don't have enough architects for all of them. So let's make sure that we allocate that resource where it's absolutely essential. And of course, a lot of times those dimensions include financial perspectives like, projects over, $5 million, there's just no way they're not going to have an architect, or if it's related to regulatory compliance or strategic alignment. But one of the things to think about, and I'm sure this is something you guys considered in the work that you've done, is an organization does have a finite capacity for execution. And this is something we certainly struggle with a lot in IT. And, it would be ideal if we could get, people to really elevate the value proposition of enterprise architecture to help really inform us about, do we really need to do all these projects? I know there's a lot of, there's a lot of money out there, there's a lot of interest, a lot of opportunity, but perhaps maybe a different perspective might be, instead of trying to do 1,000 projects at the same time and really struggle with doing any of them very well, maybe we should focus on doing, 10 strategic projects and do those very, very effectively. And this is, what I see a lot of IT organizations, kind of dying the death of 1,000 cuts because they're just trying to do way too much at the same time. And so, one of the techniques that we've come up with to help manage, some of the agile delivery in both the solution delivery space and the enterprise architecture space is a framework for helping us deal with this challenge of how done and how not done is this particular work product, and how much more done could it be? And this really gets to the whole idea of, is it done enough? Do you like your steak, rare, medium rare? Is it, well done? And so we've come up with this real simple framework to help us, provide the ability to attribute our architecture content to represent, how done it is, and represent how we, over the course of doing many different enterprise architecture projects, we can eventually, create a complete detailed description of everything in the universe, but, we just don't have that luxury. So the notion is that we can, we can put together, a model of things where we've just identified, for example, a set of processes by names, or a set of capabilities by names, or a set of applications by name. And just with a set of, names, we can start doing some planning and make some initial decisions. But then, there's going to be people that maybe don't understand the words that we've chosen, so we need to describe them with a couple of sentences or a paragraph or two, and that would bring that, architectural asset down to level 2, being described. But then, there may be more things that we have to understand in greater detail, so we need to outline those things, specify some of the most critical attributes that hopefully will glean a better understanding and acceptance with the enterprise. And then finally, we can come up with a level 4, a complete detailed specification. But what we found is that this, generally a 4-level scheme can work really well in helping us really manage that. What does done enough mean? How done is it now? And how done could it be in the future? And here's a simple example of something that we created in the context of a business process reengineering project some years ago. And even though you're seeing this content in Excel, this actually was something that was done in a formal tool set. We just extracted it out of the repository for sharing with other stakeholders and for other planning purposes. And one of the, just one of the other interesting things about this that we, could be thoughtful about is a lot of, TOGAF says, for example, in phases B, C, and D, and in phase A, we need to describe the baseline architecture and the target architecture. Particularly for business transformation projects, and not so much maybe for operational projects, but for business transformation projects, I think you need to be very careful, going on those unbounded archaeological excavations of the past. That is, the current state architecture, even though it may not be well understood or well described, it does exist. So it is something that if we need to do more research on, we can, because we can go, get our shovels out and start digging around. But the target architecture, where we're going and how we're trying to get there, that is a complete, human invention. And so I generally tend to prefer making investments, again, for transformational purposes in the target architecture. And one of the, things that came out of this particular project is we didn't actually spend really any time on the baseline architecture or the current state. What we did is we really, because it was transformational, we really focused on, well, what does the future look like? And then use that future state architecture as really more of a reference model to do some mapping of how well, does the current state relate to that? And that's kind of, represented by what you see in column H as it relates to how well, how effectively and completely those different parts of the business processes are supported by IT solutions. But what you'll see in column F was the way that, again, we provided some attribution to the different business services in the enterprise. We took a use case-driven approach in this case about how done did they need to be and how well did we need to understand them in order to deliver an effective roadmap of moving forward. And of course, this picture, evolved over time. So, ultimately, we need to figure out one of those other things, again, is how does enterprise architecture fit into the rest of the organization? We take a position that, strategic planning really needs to set the context, and enterprise architecture is really the supporting mechanism behind that, with making sure that we've got good integration and handoffs between application portfolio management and technology lifecycle management, but really looking at enterprise architecture as the umbrella over the rest of the delivery organization, and having touch points and handoffs to informing where we need to make our investments in executing projects and the resources related to it, particularly the execution of projects through the project management discipline. We need to have handoffs and touch points with, enterprise requirements management, particularly as it flows down to both solution delivery projects and systems engineering projects. And again, we look at that integration between EA and solution delivery as being one of the most essential places to start. But it does kind of assume, for whatever it's worth, is that you do have an architecture capability at the solution delivery level. And so certainly that could be, a topic of another session. But we find, again, a lot of organizations making investments in enterprise architecture without really having that capacity and capability to transition it into the solution delivery space so that they know what to make sense out of this stuff. And it really, typically evolves from a bottoms-up approach of solution delivery project, understanding the value of an architect. And then once those solutions are delivered, we need to surround them by a service management capability, and then create a end-to-end feedback loop around how we govern and operate that stuff and change it as things evolve and change. So now let's talk just a little bit about, how might applying some Agile principles get to some more operational activity as opposed to transformational activity. So in large organizations, we've seen that they've, all come to the grips with we need to have some sort of approach towards managing technology and the life cycle of technology in an enterprise. But, what we've seen a lot of organizations struggle with is, how do we, achieve our mission in technology lifecycle management, or at least our perceived mission of trying to, control technology diversity, make sure that we are exploiting investments and scaling, the investments that we've made to the benefit of the enterprise, but and the fact that we're looking at, provisioning capabilities externally, either through software as a service or package implementations, and how can we, sustain that at a very high pace that our customers expect. And so what we've seen, particularly with technology lifecycle management, for example, is, how do we balance these two different concerns of, hey, I do want to play nice in this enterprise. I really rather not use non-standard technology and all that sort of stuff, but you guys just don't respond very rapidly. You guys are, a couple cycles behind. By the time you get to my new technology request, we've already started building on it. So, I need, I've got to deliver, a solution, and having to wait for enterprise architecture and technology lifecycle management to come in and give me the gold star to, proceed is very impractical. But of course, the technology lifecycle management people are like, well, but we're trying to balance, the costs and risks of unmanaged technology proliferation. So we need to find some sort of middle ground here between the two, and how can we somehow quantify what some of those trade-offs are, and provide the right kind of incentives to get people to behave in the most effective way. And so just for an example, what we've seen in a lot of organizations is technology lifecycle management is very bureaucratic, monolithic, and it's very much based on the idea of an ask permission model, namely, please, Mr. May I use this new technology that we've just discovered and, think would add a lot of value, as opposed to we found new technology, we're on the bleeding edge of, evaluating this technology, trying to figure out what it means and if it's useful for us in the context of actually trying to solve a real business problem. So, maybe to kind of turn things upside down, and this, is very provocative, of course, in many organizations, is that it really maybe should be a beg forgiveness approach, namely, and we'll talk a little bit about this on the next slide, but the idea of not relying on humans to identify new technology and make, this centralized governing body aware of it, but have that be based on auto-discovery, because we certainly have the capability with technology that when technology exists within our enterprise, we can discover that it exists. And then have that being automatically, routed to some sort of technology manager, with the idea that there needs to be some sort of SLA associated with, once a new technology has been identified, the technology governing organization to make a decision about, is this an important enough an issue to get ahead of and engage this organization? But if I say, hey, I'm busy doing other stuff, wait until I'm ready, again, that's really unfair to that solution delivery community. So it really provides, again, the notion of, if it's important enough to redirect or evaluate, this emerging technology that's being injected into the solution delivery project, then the technology lifecycle management organization has an opportunity to bring resources to bear to do that. And if they don't have resources, then they can make a case to executive management and IT saying, hey, there's just way too much stuff going on. I'm getting spread too thin. Here's the things that are happening within the enterprise, exploiting our intelligence. And if you guys care about us, providing better direction for this stuff, you need to give us some more resources. And so we're really trying to figure out, ways that we can move again from those real monolithic, bureaucratic, traditional processes where, again, new technologies are officially registered, and then there's some kind of decision model that routes those things to different levels within our enterprise, and just getting through that process can take 90 to 180 days. Well, guess what? Some projects are going to be done by then. So we need to have a risk-driven approach towards really making sure that the time of those, particularly IT executives, directors, and managers, that we don't waste it on things that really just aren't that important. So we need to have some sort of decision tree and routing, based on, auto discovery and analytics that we've injected into our IT operating model, so that, again, we can only focus on those things that really need that kind of stewardship and guidance, but those things that aren't can have a lower barrier to entry, but still have the enterprise understand that this new technology is being introduced into the organization. And, trying to, in the case of technology lifecycle management, one of the, best practices kind of shown here on the upper right-hand corner is the idea of, measuring how rapidly we're processing requests and responding to the needs of the organization, i.e. throughput, and then what's the backlog, namely how far behind are we getting. And so using some of these, kind of stacked line charts, which are very prevalent in the Agile solution delivery space, and trying to apply those to enterprise architecture-driven processes such as technology lifecycle management. And when it comes to the EA value chain, which we talked about in our first webinar, I just want to talk a little bit about, tooling and how this stuff works. Is, we make a lot of investments on things on the left, which we, as a part of the understand and analyze part of the value chain. And this is where, we think enterprise architecture content management tools play a role. But this is really architecture at rest, and it's kind of a necessary evil. But we want to make sure that we don't, overinvest in that stuff at the expense of the things on the right hand of the value chain, which have more value and more relevance towards our enterprise stakeholders. And so we really want to focus, again, really on that EA lifecycle management, and EA content management is a way to get there. So we really think about that more as, again, representing kind of the architecture in motion. And when it comes to tooling, for example, there tend to be a set of tools that address the content management side of stuff. Those are often modeling tools or repository tools, and many of them bleed over a little bit into the right-hand side. But it's starting to, make the tool do something it really wasn't designed to do well. And then there are a set of lifecycle management tools on the right that similarly also, try to bleed a little bit into the content management. And what our experience tells us is that we really need an integrated set of tools to really support this in an agile fashion. Both modeling tools and lifecycle management tools with some sort of effective integration between the two. And so, our experience tells us that, in some ways, in contrast to, what the Agile Manifesto says about, valuing, things over processes and tools, our experience says it's pretty darn hard to stay on top of all this stuff without some kind of tooling. Doing what a lot of people do, and, as many as you probably would guess, Gartner has affirmed through market research that Microsoft Office is the most popular enterprise architecture tool set out there. It's better in a paper napkin because at least you can, email it to people and share it with stuff. But, as I'm sure many of you know, it's just no way to sustain and keep up with the pace of change throughout the enterprise. So we really find that in order to support agile enterprise architecture, tooling is absolutely essential. And again, keep in mind when you're looking at trying to bring some of those solutions to bear, that our experience has shown us with our partners that we have that there isn't a single tool that does everything. We really need an integrated set of tools, and maybe from a best-of-breed set of vendors for managing and for capturing that architecture content and then making it useful for planning and decision-making, and that we really need to understand the difference between what organizations want to do, should do, and can do, and then throw that against the capabilities that the tool provides. So we really want to make sure that our tools, to again help accelerate adoption and implementation, are supporting industry frameworks like TOGAF, support formal modeling specifications from the OMG and model-driven architecture like BPMN, UML, SysML, SBVR, so on and so forth. Want to make sure that those tools are, effectively configurable to meet your unique specific requirements. So for example, it's all well and good that a tool supports the TOGAF content meta model, but that's just really a starting point to really avoid, in my experience, the blank page syndrome. You really need to take a close look at those out-of-the-box models and, again, tune them for fit-for-purpose needs based on the kinds of problems that you're trying to solve in your organization. Make sure that you're effectively integrating those tools. There's a real big opportunity in most organizations to, figure out how to integrate enterprise architecture with other federated repositories in IT that have to do with solution delivery, IT service management, configuration management, service management, so on and so forth. And ultimately, and this will be, I think, a subject that we'll focus on very specifically in an upcoming webinar, is easy accessibility. Because at the end of the day, if people can't get to this architecture content in an easy fashion and in a timely fashion with low levels of expertise without having to have a specialized tool installed on their desktop, it's really, again, going to throw a real wrench into the ability of the enterprise architecture organization to respond, again, in an effective and timely fashion. So, that's really what I wanted to get through today, everybody. In appreciation for your time and attendance and participation. Certainly want to offer up our new web-based training environment. We've got 4 days of TOGAF training online, self-paced, and we're offering a 25% discount to AEA members. You can get a free preview of that at the URL you see here. And if you've got any further questions about this presentation or ways that APG can help support the evolution of your architecture capability, don't hesitate to contact us. So with that, Birgit, I'll throw it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for a fantastic presentation.
And, we may not have, it looks like we technically have another minute left. If people have any questions, please feel free to submit those in chat, and we will try to follow up in a timely fashion after the webinar to address those interests. So with that, Birgit, should we wrap it up?
At the end of sprint 0 or 1, thoughts on contact for Sorry, Chris, the question was from Douglas Brown. Solutions will need to know core EA guidance by the end of sprint 0 or 1. Thoughts on content for that EA MVP?
Okay, well, if I understand the question, I think you're saying that we need to provide that architectural guidance early on in the life cycle before the project gets too far, and of course that's real evident. I think, some of the things, particularly related to what we just talked about with technology lifecycle management is, informing people about what some of the standard technology platforms are, getting a sense of what kind of technology they're going to need, because again, it's particularly unfair to come to a project late in its life cycle and say, hey, you didn't use, our standard offerings, when the team said, well, I didn't even know what they were and that we had to and what they were and why we should choose them. So, providing some technology recommendations, but also I think, that's really at the bottom end of the stack, and at the top end of the stack would be some sort of contextual viewpoints of making sure that the team understands, their sandbox, where do they fit within the enterprise, what things are they expected to play with and what things are they expected not to play with, particularly as it relates to some of the steerage that we, see in many projects, and even more particularly in Agile projects because of the continual interaction, that sometimes things kind of go off plan of what the original mission is. And so enterprise architecture can help inform that with, for things such as capability models to make sure that the organization or the project team understands which capabilities it's supposed to be uplifting and affecting, what capabilities may be intersecting their project, and what applications and technologies are being used to manage those as it relates to affirming the kind of systems integration that might be important to the software development project.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. I think that was it, and we'll get all those survey questions back to you. And I thank everyone for participating today. And again, the presentation and the webinar will be available on www.globalaea.org. Thank you all.
And thank you very much.